From their earliest days, PC role-playing games had always been championed by the most hardcore of gamers. Titles in this genre earned their fan bases through deep and unforgiving but rewarding gameplay, and for a while that was the appeal. But some developers soon became aware that there was potential for the genre to appeal to a much wider demographic. Nihon Falcom was one such development studio, and as they consisted of pretty hardcore gamers themselves, they set about trying to create a new RPG experience that had the concept of kindness at its heart. Ys was the culmination of their efforts, and it was a huge success for the company, delivering on their promise and offering a unique action RPG experience with top-notch presentation. But the job was not done. Due to limitations, the story of Ys remained incomplete. Thus, work began on a sequel almost immediately, as they wanted to deliver a heartfelt conclusion to satisfy those who had been left on a cliffhanger, while improving other aspects of the game. Throughout this video, we will cover the changes in the broader video gaming landscape that influenced how and why Ys was made, the key players involved and why specific design philosophies were adopted, and what happened in and around the game's launch. But if you're a massive Ys 2 fan and want an even deeper breakdown, which will go into much more detail about the game's legacy, be sure to check out our Patreon for the extended Director's Cut edition of this video. Plus, you'll also get early access to episodes on Phantasy Star 2 and Ys 3, which are live right now, and exclusive bonus episodes on lesser-known games like Heidelide and Destiny of an Emperor. Anyone who signs up on Patreon between now and the end of the month will also get a 50% discount. But without further ado, this is the story of Ys 2, Ancient Ys Vanished, the final chapter. Rising out of the computer hobbyist scene of Japan in the early 1980s, by the end of the decade, Nihon Falcom had started to establish themselves amongst hardcore RPG fans as a developer to keep an eye on. This had been fueled by the likes of Dragon Slayer and its sequel Xanadu, which had sold more than 400,000 copies. There was also an appreciation that, while it was great that they had built up a core audience who were enthused by the Dragon Slayer lineage of games, there also needed to be an exploration of games that were slightly less intense and had the potential to appeal to a wider audience. Ys was the game they hoped could achieve that objective. To accomplish this, director and programmer Masaya Hashimoto and scenario writer Tomoyoshi Miyazaki focused their efforts on going against the grain of the RPG genre at the time, gambling on the idea that being kinder to the player while still offering a top-tier RPG experience would pay off. Their hunch turned out to be correct, as Ys resonated with audiences, and the nature of its success prompted some interesting changes to happen at the company. By this point, Nihon Falcom was becoming something of a machine, and around when Ys launched, that machine was operating at maximum capacity. They now had multiple development teams working on concurrent projects, and while Hashimoto worked with his team to ensure Ys delivered on expectations, Yoshio Kiya was still helming the Dragon Slayer series. In this regard, 1986 had seen the expansion of Xanadu in the form of Xanadu Scenario 2 and the release of the third mainline installment called Romancia. Dragon Slayer 4, Jazzle Family, then launched just 1 month after Ys. It meant Nihon Falcom was turning into an environment where high performance was expected, one where if success was achieved, momentum could be generated. But if momentum slowed, new initiatives had to be explored. That was, after all, how Ys came to be in the first place, as after the release of Azteca 2 Templo del Sol at the back end of 1986, the franchise was put on hiatus and resources were shifted around. Tsuneyuki Miyamoto, for example, having previously worked on populating instruction manuals, was given the chance to write the scenario of Azteca 2 and take on some programming duties. But after the game launched, and it wasn't that successful, they were put back onto writing instruction manuals. Then there was Kao Yokoyama, who had worked on Xanadu as art director before fulfilling the same role on Azteca 2. They subsequently left the company after the game shipped. It was a work hard, play hard environment where everyone was expected to help out, and this approach, which enabled for the quick turnaround of games with a high chance of pleasing the fanbase, saw Nihon Falcom start to catch up and overtake their competitors in the PC space. Heidelide, for example, was a trailblazer back in 1984, selling over 1 million copies on PC. and it served as an inspiration for some aspects of Ys. But by 1987, its sales had diminished, something confirmed by its Famicom port only selling around 5,000 copies when it launched in 1989. And although Western games like Ultima and Wizardry had once been drivers for innovation, the arrival of Japanese games of similar or greater quality made them less relevant. Nihon Falcom did, of course, need to keep an eye on what their contemporaries were doing on the Famicom and Master System, as 1986 and 87 had been huge years for the RPG genre on those platforms, with games such as Dragon Quest, Phantasy Star and Final Fantasy opening the eyes of consumers and developers in ways that they could only previously have dreamt of. They also, in some cases, sold in the millions, but they had done so on different platforms, targeting different audiences. And although contemporaries started to be swayed by this, one of which was Square, who started out as a PC-focused developer, Nihon Falcom were more than happy to stay in their lane, assert their dominance over the PC market, and continue down the path that so far had continued to be very successful for them. With everything going well, after the release of Ys and Dragon Slayer 4, Masayuki Kato, the founder of the company, then made a huge decision. With the software side of the business flourishing, the office Nihon Falcom worked out of in Tachigawa, that was still connected with the original Computerland Tachigawa PC shop, was starting to feel a bit cramped. To alleviate this problem, in August of 1987, Kato signed the lease on a much bigger office that was still based in Tachigawa. It was around 1.5 to 2 times larger, and the new space allowed the various teams to have a degree of separation. But Kato was adamant that the original vibe of the office should be retained, as should their connection with the fans that had grown up with them. This was maintained in numerous ways. First, the company didn't religiously use the model of cubicles that were becoming so popular, with them instead adopting a more open floor plan. This then meant it was easy for developers to share ideas, and people like Kiya and Hashimoto were able to mingle with junior staff, as opposed to being isolated and unapproachable. The second way was that Kato wanted the essence of Computerland Tachigawa to still be there. This meant the office had a public-facing section where fans could walk in, not only buy Falcom games, but also merchandise such as CDs, stickers and books, with third-party products even being stocked in these categories as a way of highlighting the associations Nihon Falcom wanted to have, and of course, generating a little bit of extra revenue. The layout was also designed so that people visiting the shop might even get to see some of the developers walking around. So on any given day, a fan might go into the store and purchase a game, and be able to say hello to the director at the same time if they just happen to be there. In a more practical sense, the store also provided Nihon Falcom with a place to host official events in relation to their own products, cutting down on the overheads associated with renting other places. This aggressive push highlighted the ambitions of Nihon Falcom. They were not intending to slow down. With Dragon Slayer continuing to perform well, and Ys providing a solid foundation, serialization was the key. Thus, while Kyo got straight to work on another game in the Dragon Slayer franchise, which was to be called Sorcerian, Nihon Falcom partnered with Namco to create a port of Dragon Slayer 4 for the Famicom. They partnered with Hudson Soft to create Foe Xanadu, also for the Famicom, and Hashimoto was tasked with not only overseeing the initial ports of Ys to other PC platforms, but then overseeing the development of another game in the Ys franchise. Each move was prudent and calculated, and as the original Ys had ended on a massive narrative cliffhanger, there was also an assumption within the fanbase that the continuation of Ys was never in doubt. Ys 2 was a necessity, and Nihon Falcom was only too happy to oblige both its creators and its fans by giving the green light for the production of a sequel. If you're enjoying the video so far, then might we suggest checking out our Patreon. You can find a longer, deeper, extended edition of this video, while also getting ad-free early access to videos on Phantasy Star 2 and Ys 3, and exclusive access to videos on Hydralide and Destiny of an Emperor. By becoming a patron, you'll also get early access to all of our future episodes, as well as podcasts and Discord access, and you can also vote on what we cover as our out-of-sequence episode every season. Whether you join us on Patreon though, or continue to watch us here on YouTube, we just want to say thank you for the support. But for now, let's get right into the development of Ys 2. Owing to how the Dragon Slayer franchise had grown since its first release in 1984, Nihon Falcom had shown they were very open to exploring how games could be expanded. But due to the frenetic pace they worked at, planning wasn't always the highest consideration. This manifested with Ys, as though the team worked hard to make the best game they possibly could, while also attempting to subvert genre expectations. No matter what they tried or how hard they pushed, they found it impossible to ship within the intended time while being able to finish the story of Ys in a logical manner where everything wrapped up in a nice, neat conclusion. This culminated in the infamous cliffhanger that greeted players at the end of the game, and there was an assumption amongst the player base that the team had some kind of master plan for how everything was going to conclude, but that wasn't quite the case. As soon as Ys had shipped, Hashimoto, as mentioned, was tasked with working on the first wave of ports. There was no time for rest or reflection. It was only once the assigned work was concluded that the rest of the ports were delegated out to other team members and third parties, and Hashimoto was finally given some space to think about what was actually next for Ys. The majority of the team were still busy though, so according to Tomo Yamane, who had assisted with graphics for the first game, Hashimoto held a meeting with Takehiro Ora, who had also been part of the graphics team, and this meeting had one simple goal: to try and figure out how they should actually proceed. They knew that Ys 2 had to be made so that players of the first game could receive some kind of closure, but there hadn't been any thought put into how this could actually be accomplished. According to Ora, Hashimoto simply had a desire for the sequel to go to the sky, because that's where the root cause of evil was. But beyond that, he had no idea how that desire was going to tie in with the story they'd already presented, or what else was going to happen throughout the rest of the game. In short, there were no concrete plans for a sequel, and there was not even a rough outline for what the game's story could look like. Regardless, once the team started to become available during July of 1987, development progressed in earnest, despite there not really being any kind of plan. As expected though, for a sequel of this nature, the same core team that developed Ys were called back again. This saw Kato as producer, Hashimoto as designer and director, Miyazaki as the scenario writer, Seigo Akitani as the art director, and it again featured Koshiro and Ishikawa on the score, accompanied by Hideya Nagata. However, there was one major change. After the release of Dragon Slayer 4, Kiya started preparing for his next endeavour. But having been impressed by the pixel art of Yamane, Kiya requested that he join the Dragon Slayer team instead. And this meant Ora became the main person creating graphical assets throughout the early stages of development. Wasting no time, the team set about picking up their work right where Ys had left off. But as there was no real plan, everything was on the table. It was at this point that Akitani lobbied for the creation of a new heroine. And this caused some consternation amongst the team, especially from Yamane, who despite not being a direct part of the production team at this point, was still in close enough physical vicinity to hear what was being decided. In Yamane's mind, Fina was a strong enough heroine, but upon reflection, Hashimoto did not agree, and along with other members of the team, it was decided that a new heroine, who became known as Lydia, could add value to the story. The challenge was that the story still had not taken shape, so they had no idea how Lilia was going to be incorporated. In lieu of any concrete decisions, Akitani therefore decided to create some general characteristics, such as a requirement for Lilia to be ill. But that was as deep as things got at this point. With so much up in the air, and Hashimoto being unsure as to the broader vision of the game, the decision was taken to just start small and build from there. And they would simply then keep on expanding until what they had started to take some kind of shape. This led to the creation of the ruins of Moondoria, a small location that could be used to test various ideas and concepts. It was during this phase that Ora decided that they should move away from some of the mystery they tried to present in Ys 1 through subtle environmental storytelling, with them instead opting to be much more varied in how the lore was delivered. But it was also where Hashimoto explored new design concepts relating to collision detection, but also how players could interact and communicate with NPCs. Perhaps the biggest addition, however, during this phase came with the inclusion of magic. Magic was a common feature in other video game role-playing games, and indeed tabletop role-playing games, and it usually offered the player a variety of ways in which they could attack enemies, heal themselves, or navigate the world. But it was also not featured in the first game as a mechanic, and it was not mentioned in the Books of Ys, in-game items in the original that delivered a ton of lore. This presented something of a lore-based quandary, but that typified how the early stages of development panned out, as ideas that were voted in by the team, such as the inclusion of Lydia or the now existence of magic, just had to be figured out. To solve this problem, Miyazaki proposed a solution. In the Book of Tova, a key item from the first game, it was mentioned that the Land of East was governed by 2 goddesses and 6 priests. So Miyazaki simply came up with the idea of tying a magic spell to each one of the priests. Alongside fire, this meant they needed to come up with 5 other spells, but that was a challenge for another day, as after finishing up with the ruins of Mundoria, next on their haphazard path through development was the creation of their first town, where Lilia was to be encountered at the insistence of Okatani. This process of taking everything step by step continued, and soon the overall story of the game began to come into view. Each piece made them more sure of the direction development was heading, and things naturally began to fall into place, sometimes through necessity and sometimes through moments of inspiration. In an uncommon move for RPGs of that era, for example, it was decided that East 2's narrative should pick up immediately after the cliffhanger conclusion of the first game, following Adol's awakening in the Land of East. And based on that, the most logical course for the game from that point was to focus on the actual exploration of the storied titular land and the strange goings-on that seemed to be happening there. To help Adol in this quest was a new, expanded cast of NPCs, including Lilia. As opposed to other RPGs at the time that had a party of characters who supported the main protagonist, in the first East, focus was placed instead around the idea of an invisible party, a cast of unique and memorable NPCs who helped Adol along his adventure by offering him aid and advice at various points in the narrative. With East 2, the developers sought to push this concept even further, by adding even more characters in Adol's support network than the first game, and this dovetailed nicely in with the game's overall increased scope. Featuring more locales, more dungeons, and more bosses than East 2 was shaping up to be an ambitious game that stood to offer players even more for them to sink their teeth into. And despite the uneasy start to development, Nihon Falcom now had every reason to believe that they would be successful in delivering another hit, as they had the benefit of not only the bespoke programming tools they had used to create the first game's visuals and mechanics, but they also now had a much better idea of what it was they wanted to focus on when it came to improving over the original. The core of this design philosophy was summarized in the game's new motto, kindness into emotion. East had been created with the idea of being kind to players, and the goal of East 2 was to take that solid foundation and use it to build a deeper and more emotional gameplay experience. As a result, many of the main mechanics that comprised East's gameplay loop were maintained for East 2, such as the Save Anywhere feature, fast leveling, bump combat, and regenerative health. The game's equipment system was also a near carbon copy, maintaining the simple but effective function and offering the player linear upgrade paths for Adol's armor and weapons, as well as a collection of accessories which granted a variety of equipable buffs. But the team was aware that they couldn't just recycle everything they had done previously, and so they looked to expand the depth of East's combat and exploration through the game's new magic system. Building on their initial fire spell, the team set to work on crafting 5 additional unique spells, all with their own specific applications and use cases. And this was driven by a desire for magic to be more than just another way for Adol to overcome combat challenges. Whether it be finding hidden passages while traversing in the field, transforming Adol into a monster, returning to previously visited locations, stopping enemies in their tracks, or creating an impenetrable barrier. These spells added a new dimension to East 2's gameplay that allowed for the creation of even more interesting scenarios and puzzles to test players with, beyond just getting the next key item. This integration of magic into the very fabric of East 2's gameplay was best exemplified by the game's boss design. In the first game, bosses required careful timing with Adol's bump attacks in order to deal damage, but by the end of the game, even though boss attack patterns had gotten harder, the actual combat itself hadn't changed in depth. And this was because, for East 2, the developers wanted to challenge players, surprising those that had rushed into the game, and thus designed the bosses to be mainly weak to magic, requiring a change-up in tactics with regards to how the player engaged with them, with the game sometimes even resembling that of a shooter. The implementation of a magic system also necessitated an addition to the game's HUD so that players could keep track of their MP, which would drain as they used their spells, but this was not the only part of the game's UI that received an update. Hearing back from fans who had enjoyed Ys, the developers had taken note that many of the players found the game's inventory and menu systems to be cumbersome, and thus they decided to go back to the drawing board and redesign that aspect of the game, hoping to take another shot at the problem, again with kindness in mind. In the first game, these elements had all been in a single menu, making quick navigation or switching equipped items on the fly more complicated than it needed to be. For Ys 2, it was decided that these different menus would be split up, with each one bound to a different key on the keyboard, which the developers hoped would allow players to navigate them easily, improving the game's flow and accessibility. These changes to the game's menus and UI were also part of a wide effort on behalf of the development team to push the overall presentation of Ys 2 even further than they had done before. It saw the team add even more animation to the game, which improved graphical effects for key points in the story, such as during the final battle, which featured animated, roaring flames in the background. Where it was most obvious though was Ys 2's opening sequence. Hoping to really wow players, the team crafted an entire anime-style intro movie to the game, featuring sprawling vistas, detailed character art set to an intense soundtrack, and even a fully animated moment featuring the new character, Lilia, which they were sure would capture the attention and imaginations of anyone who saw it. This concept of a more cinematic approach found its way into other aspects of the game as well, as the game's explorable areas were more varied than the locales of Ys, and extra effort was put into making them fit and add to the narrative of the game. Vast fields, caverns, mines, frigid mountains of ice, and even volcanic hellscapes were just some of the places Adol would encounter on his journey throughout the land of Ys. And Okatani, who was responsible for the game's maps, in addition to advising on the game's arts and graphics, worked diligently to have these areas flow effortlessly and naturally into one another, giving the game a cohesive yet dynamic and interconnected feel. These huge leaps were only possible due to the fact that the majority of the game was built upon what they had already accomplished during Ys's development, and thereby it gave the developers the runway to ensure that Ys 2 not only stood apart from their previous efforts, but from all other PC games being released at the same time, something that was further aided by Yamane rejoining the team after Sorcerian had shipped in December of 1987. This ambition though was also felt by the music team, and it saw Koshiro, Ishikawa and Nagata push to ensure that Ys 2 surpassed their accomplishments from the first game. The music of Ys had been a highlight for many players, and Nihon Falcom's subsequent commercial release of the music had proven to be a smart business move by the company. And so the prospect of doing it all again, but bigger less than a year later, was a daunting task. Like the rest of the development team though, the sound team was also well aware that they couldn't just get away with reusing all the same music from the previous game, so they turned their efforts to crafting as much new music as possible, wherever possible. Ys's soundtrack featured around 10 to 15 songs depending on the version, a respectable tracklist for a game from that era, but for Ys 2 this number was nearly doubled to around 25. Though Koshiro and Ishikawa have stated that the actual number was closer to 50 before they narrowed it down to the final tracklist. Again, a good deal of why this was possible was due to the fact that much of the groundwork had already been laid, such as Koshiro's custom sound drivers, and this allowed the team to push way beyond what they had accomplished previously, while also doing it faster, delivering a soundtrack that they felt lived up to Ys 2's increased focus on the emotional core of the narrative. As development entered into its final stretch, Hashimoto's team pushed as hard as they could to show their fans what they could do. Their initial development stumbling blocks had been cleared, and their vision was keenly in focus. They had learnt from both their experiences making Ys and by listening closely to fans and critical reception, all of which helped them to create a gameplay experience for Ys 2 that was not just more emotional and deep, but also leaned further into the core idea of kindness. Even more, they had once again been able to accomplish this task in a very short space of time. Though there's no official statement for how long it actually took to make Ys 2, when considering that the first game launched in the summer of 1987, it's speculated that development of the sequel only took around 8 to 9 months. Few development teams would have been able to double their efforts on a game's sequel and improve on nearly every aspect of the first game in such a short space of time. And so, when development wrapped up towards the beginning of 1988, it was understandable that Hashimoto's team was just eager to show the world the conclusion of Adol's story. To support the game's launch in Japan, as well as build fan excitement, Nihon Falcom ran print ads across various computer magazines such as Micom Basic. These ads highlighted to consumers the guiding philosophy behind the game's development: kindness into emotion. And it tried their best to detail all of the impressive changes and improvements that they'd been able to make. Because Ys 2 was a sequel though, the print ad campaign also made a point of communicating that playing the first game was not necessary, though it was encouraged, and so a mini advertisement for the original game was also included. Despite this, they knew that irrespective of their reassurances, it would still be difficult to sell newcomers on a sequel if they had not played the first game, not least because the game had been titled Ys 2 Ancient Ys Vanished, the final chapter. So they revisited a concept they had used when Ys released to make sure that anyone who bought Ys 2 would not be left in the dark with regards to the game's backstory. Like the previous game, this meant they included, as part of the game's manual, a 30-page illustrated backstory in the form of a storybook retelling, and it ran through the events of the first game, while even recapping some of Adolf's past from before the events of Ys, with everything accompanied by gorgeous, full-colour artwork. The publisher also made sure to use in-store demos for the game to help sell players on Ys 2's merits, believing that if they were able to see the game's impressive visuals firsthand, that it would go a long way towards encouraging sales, and thus they made sure to put the opening anime-style sequence front and center. Alongside these direct efforts by Nihon Falcom to push the game, Ys 2 also benefited from something else that had happened earlier in the year, the release of Enix's Dragon Quest III in February. The Dragon Quest franchise was at the center of a cultural phenomenon in Japan, nearly single-handedly spurring the growing RPG trend for the casual gaming crowd. Therefore, when Dragon Quest III came out to even more critical and fan acclaim than the two previous games, selling millions of units in a short space of time, it was clear that consumer hunger for RPGs was at an all-time high. Ys 2 was released 2 months later on the 22nd of April 1988, perfectly positioned to take advantage. And luckily for Nihon Falcom, the combination of a marketing campaign focused on Ys 2's presentation and the rising popularity of RPGs led to the game doing very well commercially upon launch. It featured in Login Magazine's Softlock Top 30 in the months following its release, and it was the 32nd best-selling software game in the January 1989 issue of Micon Basic's Supersoft Hot 50 list. Part of this success was due to Falcom again repeating lessons they had learned with Ys, and quickly putting out ports for the other personal computer models shortly after the initial launch on the PC-88. To speed everything up, specific staff members were tasked with overseeing the various ports. Okatani, for example, oversaw the PC-98 version, whereas Miyazaki oversaw the Sharp X1 port, with them both launching in June. Kurata and Hashimoto then oversaw the FM77 and MSX2 versions, which launched in July. While all these versions offered players a similar experience to the original PC-88 version, the one that was noticeably different was the MSX2 port. This was because the MSX2 version had a lower display resolution, meaning that its visuals lagged behind those of the other ports. But it also featured a less impressive soundtrack, despite the sound team's best attempts to make the arrangements as faithful as possible to the original release. Official sales figures for Ys 2 were never revealed, but it's reported that by the end of 1988, the game had sold around 200,000 copies, which, though falling short of the heights set by some of Falcom's previous efforts, still established Ys 2 as a successful sequel, and proved once again that players were responding positively to Hashimoto's team's fusion of player-friendly features and action RPG gameplay. The following year, like Ys before it, Ys 2 also received a Famicom port in 1990. Even though the Famicom version of Ys ended up being a rather different experience than the original PC-88 version, as it was produced by a third-party developer called Victor Musical Industries, it ended up as one of the best-selling Famicom games released in 1988. Based on this, Nihon Falcom chose to work with Victor Musical Industries again, selecting them as their third-party developer to help bring Ys 2 to Nintendo's home console. They made another honest attempt at adopting Ys's gameplay for the home console market, but this time their efforts were unfortunately overshadowed by Nihon Falcom's own efforts in the home console market, namely due to the release of Ys Book 1 and 2, which was released at the end of 1989 on the PC Engine almost half a year earlier than the Famicom port of Ys 2. This was of course an issue, because Ys Book 1 and 2 acted as complete remakes of the original two games. Though combined into a single package, both Ys 1 and 2 were still kept as separate experiences, but featured numerous graphical upgrades. And there was an expanded use of the anime-style cutscenes that the original version of Ys 2 had introduced. East Book 1 and 2 also made good use of the PC Engine's CD-ROM expansion to deliver a high-quality audio experience, allowing for an updated and reorchestrated soundtrack, and even the addition of voice acting.
When I found you lying here on the ground, your body surrounded by a pure white light.
It meant the subsequent release of East 2 on the Famicom just felt subpar by comparison, as it was based on the PC-88 version, not the PC Engine version. This then laid to rest any thoughts of localization for the default version of East 2, as there were already plans to bring East Book 1 and 2 to North America in 1990 on the PC Engine's regional equivalent, the TurboGrafx X16. This meant that those who played East on the Master System never got a conclusion on that console, or even on Sega's 16-bit upgrade, the Genesis, which was known as the Mega Drive in Europe. In some ways, this was unfortunate, but it did mean North American and European fans were able to forgo the same experience as Japanese fans. The enhanced gameplay and presentation of the localized version of East Book 1 and 2 wowed critics, with specific praise for the games coming from EGM and GamePro. And the fact that the West had not received the localization of the then 2-year-old follow-up to East was quickly forgotten. Even though the original version of East 2 was overshadowed by East Book 1 and 2, more so than East, which benefited from being the first game in the series, East 2 ended up as a worthy follow-up that impressed both fans and critics alike at launch. Nihon Falcom's strategy of designing the first game around the idea of kindness had paid off, and they knew that by further refining this idea, they could deliver something truly special. Thus, they revisited every aspect of the game, using their already strong foundation as scaffolding to reach even greater heights. And by doing so, they were able to create a game that was not only bigger and longer than its predecessor, but also had an unmatched, cutting-edge graphical presentation and expansive soundtrack, a truly astonishing feat given the game's quick turnaround time. But it was East 2's delivery of the conclusion of the story that began in East that cemented it in the hearts of fans, as the game really did exemplify the development team's idea of kindness into emotion, building on the themes and cast of the first game and sticking the landing in a way that few sequels do. Something that showed the RPG world that Nihon Falcom was not to be underestimated. However, even though everything seemed great from the outside, the success of East 2 came at a cost, and the franchise was about to venture into some unknown territory. But with that, thank you so much for watching, everyone. My name is Darryl, and together with Colin and Chris, we hope you enjoyed listening to the incredible development story of East 2. Hopefully, as you watched through the video, you found some interesting nuggets of information that perhaps you didn't know before. If you did, then please consider showing us how much you appreciate the effort that's put into researching, writing and editing a video like this by giving it a like. We also want to give a massive thanks to everyone who supports us on Patreon, as they allow us to create extensive videos like this. Alright everyone, this is Darryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more RPG goodness.